Alright guys, this is geometry, and to be taking geometry you've taken Algebra 1, and so what we're first actually going to do is, you've solved equations before, but you haven't had to justify the steps you've had to take to solve equations. And so what we're actually going to talk about is some of the properties which allow you to solve equations that you've done before. And so what we're actually going to do is just look at some of these properties and explain them, and try to explain them in a way where you can not only understand what they mean, but also how they apply to solving equations. So I'm actually going to try to just go over the first three first, and that's the addition property, the multiplication property, and the subtraction property. And so actually fill in the blanks here and then explain what that means. So the addition property of equality says that if two things are equal, so if A equals B, then A plus C equals B plus C. Now what that is telling me is that if two things are the same, or two things are equal, then I can add the same thing to both of them and they will still be equal. So to kind of explain this in a way that may help you visually, is imagine over here I have the scale over here. So let's imagine I had, let's say, a 5-pound weight. So 5 pounds over here, and 5 pounds over here. So again, we have the same amount on both sides. So you would agree that that would be a balanced scale. So would it still be balanced if I added the same thing to both sides? So let's imagine I put a 2-pound weight over here and another 2-pound weight over there. Would they still be balanced? And the obvious answer is, of course, yes, they would be balanced. So what we're saying is if we have two things that are balanced or equal, that if I add the same thing to both sides, it will still be equal. Now, the way you've done this in the past would be in equation form. So you've probably solved equations like this, x minus 2 equals 5. And so we applied the addition property by solving this equation. So what you would probably do naturally would be add 2 to both sides. Now here's the question though, why are you allowed to do that? The reason you're allowed to do that is because of the addition property of equality, which tells me that if I say that x minus 2 equals 5, meaning that they are balanced or that they are the same thing, if I add 2 to both of those, it will still be equal. In the same way that adding 2 pounds here still made the scale balanced. So when I added 2 to both sides, I ended up with x equals 7. So I could justify adding 2 to both sides because of the addition property of equality. And so what you're going to have to end up doing in a lot of problems in geometry is justifying your answer. And the way you do that is by understanding certain properties. The first property is the addition property of equality. And again, all this says, basically what you've heard before in the past is I can do whatever I want to both sides of an equation as long as I do it to both sides of the equation. Now that's not actually true in all cases, but in addition it is true. I can add whatever I want to both sides of an equation, or to one side of an equation, as long as I also add it to the other side. And so that would be the addition property of equality. So put it simply, if two things are equal, I can add the same thing to both of them and they still be equal. Alright, so that's the addition property. The subtraction property is pretty much the same thing. So if A equals B, then A minus C equals B minus C. And this is kind of the same concept. So I'm going to come back over here to my scale. So let's imagine we have a couple weights on the scale. So we'll have a 5-pound weight and a 2-pound weight on both sides of the scale. So what the subtraction property says, that if I have a balanced scale and I take away the same amount from both sides, I'm still going to have a balanced scale. So imagine for a second I took off the 2-pound weights. Would it still be balanced? And of course it would be. So that's what the subtraction property is telling me. If I take something, the same amount from two equal things, they will still be equal things. They'll still be equal. So the way you've done this in the past would be something like this. If I said solve this equation, you would say, well, I would subtract 2 from both sides and end up with x equals 3. And again, the reason you're allowed to do that is because of the subtraction property of equality, which says if two things are equal and I subtract the same thing from both of them, they will still be equal. And so I'm going to leave it right there. I'm actually going to do the multiplication property on the next video, but I wanted to go through those two properties, and I'm going to kind of go through each property to make sure you understand what they actually mean and how they apply to solving equations.